Well, good evening.
Is that mic on?
I don't know. Is the mic on? May I start singing now? Okay. Good evening. My name is Jay Bruce. I'm the director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing and a philosophy professor at John Brown University. We are so grateful for you for joining us. This is a lecture that is actually beginning a colloquium for the weekend on the road to freedom and prosperity. The road to freedom and prosperity. This is a joint venture of the Center for Faith and Flourishing at John Brown University and the Arkansas Center for Research and Economics, or the very coolly acronymed ACRE, at the University of Central Arkansas. This began in part because last year was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre. And one of the things that's interesting about the progress and prosperity of Black Americans is that whereas 101 years ago, racists could burn the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and burn down Black Wall Street, now racists would actually have to make their way to New York City, to Lower Manhattan, and to the financial district to actually burn down the Wall Street because of the accomplishments of Black Americans. So while not wanting to in any way diminish the real horrors and sins of America, we also want to be grateful for the opportunity to enjoy the blessings of liberty and to prosper. We have, one of the dreams that I have of events like this is to create a thick social network of colleges and universities across the state of Arkansas. So many thanks to the 5 colleges and universities represented here, as well as some of our friends who have been so kind to join us. Thank you. Now, our speaker this evening, Wilfred Reilly, is a political science professor at Kentucky State University and the author of, among other things, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. I heard Dr. Reilly actually on the Commentary Magazine podcast, and then and became a new subscriber to Commentary, and so I've read him in the pages of Commentary. And then for this book, I read his book, for this colloquium, I read his book, Taboo. Dr. Reilly, I can distinguish him in 2 ways. Number one, he puts the science back into social science. So I love when he's asked a question that he almost invariably quotes some statistic. All too often we hear people speak in broad generalities about their own policy positions, but Dr. Reilly really does try to drill down to the facts. The second is he's really funny. And it's so rare to hear academics speak on controversial issues in a way that's amusing and heartfelt. And can I get a witness that we need to be able to laugh and to joke as we talk about these, both the difficulties facing people in America, but also the hope for the road ahead. Let's give Dr. Reilly a warm welcome.
All right. My first question was going to be, is this mic on? Can you guys hear me? Yes. All right, fair enough. So I'm Wilfred Reilly, as was just rather eloquently outlined. I'm a professor of politics at Kentucky State University in Frankfort, capital of Kentucky, and I'm the author of the books Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. And my topic here today, if I recall the header correctly, is narrative versus reality. What problems like racism really look like in the now. I was originally asked here as one of 2 or 3 different debaters, essentially, to discuss our take on issues like quote-unquote systemic racism today. And as it turns out, I'm here alone representing, I guess, the mostly con position. There are a lot of easy jokes that I could make about this. Social justice warriors rarely agree to debate. That's okay because I'm right anyhow. So on down the line. I don't think either of those is fully fair, actually, in context. As I understand, Dr. Johnson had another appointment. So banter aside, I guess my goal would be to honestly sum up what I think the other side's position to be, and then try to respond to it with my own, and then hopefully go through a fairly long Q&A with you guys and really engage the audience for about 40-45 minutes, see what you think about the presentation, and field any questions which you might have, especially those from the students in the crowd. So in terms of the idea of racism or systemic racism, I hope it's fairly obvious that I myself am not a crazy bigot. I'm a black man who teaches at a historically black college, Kentucky State University, and I don't think that anyone denies that racism, outgroup bias, exists in America today. But my own position is that there's almost no support for the claim that there's massive ongoing ethnic conflict in the USA in 2022, and that the systemic label is broad enough to mean almost literally anything, or alternatively, nothing at all. So the basic argument for contemporary systemic racism, if you read your Kendi or D'Angelo or Andrew Hacker or Bell Hooks, is very often that disparities equal discrimination. So there are still gaps in group performance in American society today, in terms of, for example, test scores. And unless you are a bigot, the claim goes, you have to attribute these to racism, which is usually presented as current contemporary racism. A common way of putting this, as Dr. Kendi does, is bias within systems. So the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, for example, by the author I just mentioned, is extraordinarily open about this. So the author, Dr. Ibram Kendi, argues that when you see a gap in performance between any two large groups, the only two possible explanations are some kind of racism, however subtle, one, or two, that one of the groups is deeply, probably permanently, and I and many others read him as meaning probably genetically, quote unquote, inferior to the other. These are the literal words in the text. So possibility one would be some kind of prejudice, however hidden, however subtle. Possibility two would be inferiority. And obviously, the catch here is that no one at all wants to go with point number two, so everyone goes with point number one. It's bias within systems that explains everything. The national mass media, which in the United States both like simple and sensationalistic concepts, and leans 93% left as versus 7% right, according to a famous study done by Pew back in 2004. I think the gap might have intensified since then, but can't really speak to that with any authority, tends to support this position. And so we have the contemporary concept of hidden systemic bigotry. That's basically the idea. We see gaps throughout society across a number of different arenas. Income, for example, is something I'll talk about throughout the speech. And the argument is that these surely aren't due to, for example, genetic inferiority. The United States has a terrible history, which no one really disputes. So the explanation is some kind of prejudice out there. And there have been many attempts made to locate this, and for example, the criminal justice system. The problem with this, as quantitative social scientists from the OG Thomas Sowell on the right to William Julius Wilson of the University of Chicago on the left have pointed out over the years and the decades, is that this argument doesn't explain many of the phenomena that we actually see in our complicated, brawling society today. Like Asians outperforming both blacks and whites across almost every metric by a gap larger than the one that we see between blacks and whites. For example, this goes unanswered, and this all too often simply goes unmentioned. In reality, there's an obvious third way here between sort of the Al Sharpton explanation and the Arthur Jensen explanation, if you will. Large groups like blacks and whites and Asians, the third of which is almost a meaningless term, are different from one another for a whole variety of reasons, what you could broadly call culture, the environments that people choose or wind up in, past racism, which obviously affects things like wealth, even random luck, stochastic random chance, something we don't take into account nearly often enough. It's worth noting that children born into the same family perform radically differently in life. There's an entire series of studies of twins that find that the gap in performance between identical or fraternal twins, usually about 15 or 20%. So the core idea, deviating from the speech here, so excuse me if there's some rambling, but the core idea, well, you never know. The core idea underlying a lot of this is that absent prejudice or genetic inferiority or something absolutely terrible, right, you would see all people perform pretty much equally. This really is the raw idea of blank slateism, that across racial lines, probably sexual lines, everyone, individual lines really, everyone would be pretty much the same, turning in roughly the same performance. And the response to this is that this is actually one of the least evidenced claims ever made. There's almost no argument that any intelligent person could forward to support the idea that this is true. So to show actual racism today, and I think there's still quite a bit of it, by the way, and we'll get to that in the last third of the speech, but to show actual racism today, you have to adjust for these things using the kind of scientific models that you guys are learning to draw up at John Brown and the University of Arkansas and Central Arkansas and the other rock-solid colleges that have students in attendance. And then show me and show the rest of your audience that similar people who are different only in terms of the characteristic of race or whatever it is that you're looking at, sex or gender, are in fact treated differently. When you get into this sector professionally, by the way, you'll be shocked by how rarely journalists and even academics do this. If you read through news articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post, they'll very often simply say something like, Hispanics on average are more likely to be rejected for mortgages than Caucasians, without really adjusting for anything else, like, for example, credit scores. Very often taking 15 minutes to look at why this might be eliminates the threatening potential explanation in either of the two sort of terrible directions that I've laid out. So I'll give a very simple kind of non-controversial example of this. The most common age for a white guy, and you kind of see this evidence just looking around the room, no offense to anyone here. Most common age for a white guy is 58. The most common age for a black guy is 27. You can confirm that just by Googling those ages and the words Pew 2019. Now that's the modal average, as the words most common indicate. The median gap can fall beneath a decade. The most recent estimate I saw was 12 years. But we're talking about literally dozens of years here, 12 to 30, dividing these two groups. Frankly speaking, any estimate for either income and wealth differences on the left or crime rates and bad behavior on the right, it's also important to note, that doesn't include this comment that the average black male is decades younger than the average white male, is simply openly dishonest. And as Thomas Sowell and many others have pointed out, both gaps do close very, very sharply, sometimes by half, if you make this extraordinarily simple adjustment. This isn't journal publishable stuff here. It's simply noting the 30-year gap and picking guys that are the same age. And there are dozens of variables, if you will, like this. SAT and board scores, crime rate. But again, less controversially, whether or not people live in the South, where wages are way lower across the board, we can speculate on why. I mean, obviously, we're in the great state of Arkansas here, which, like my own home of Kentucky, struggles with the issue of poverty. But this is simply a fact, and it is also a fact that 50+% of African Americans and Latinos live in this region. If you count the Southwest, only about 15% of whites do. So in this professional context, in the context of this basic idea of don't always trust the media, something you may be hearing for the first time ever, but in this basic context of, conduct some multivariate analysis if we're speaking to a collegiate audience, it's worth looking at some of the claims of systemic racism that I originally expected, as I said, to bat back and forth with my opponent. In this frame of analysis, as they are almost never looked at, getting away from the back and forth partisan nonsense in the media and actually breaking out what the data is and adjusting for some of this stuff. And again, if you disagree with my take on this afterward, feel more than free to talk to me about it. But the Black Lives Matter movement provides a good sort of first example of narrative versus reality. If you remember the original claims here, not sort of police brutality is bad, which for the record I agree with, but the original comments from Cherno Biko and Sean King and Benjamin Crump, the argument was that hundreds or thousands of totally innocent people were being killed annually, and that most of them, or at least most of the totally unjustified cases, involved Black Americans. For a reminder of what this was, I would recommend people read Crump's book, which if I recall is titled Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored Americans. So people believed this to a really, really significant degree. If I could ask, you guys at the front table here, how many unarmed Black Americans do you think are killed by the police in a typical year? Anyone who wants to volunteer? Ma'am? Sir? Less than 10. Okay, actually, that's fewer than the actual number. Fair enough. All right, the times are changing. But, yeah. People were getting ready to argue with me. They read the whole thing. A lot of crap in here, but some real numbers. All right, fair enough. Both valid estimates. But so the Skeptic Research Center, actually, the reason I asked that, I wasn't trying to pick on either one of you guys, you're just the two in the front. The Skeptic Research Center actually did sort of a well-done large-in poll on this earlier this year, and they found that the average American who identifies as liberal or very liberal seems to think the number is around 1,000. If I recall correctly, about 34 or 35% of people who identified as very liberal or as leftist thought the number of specifically unarmed brothers who were killed by the police in a typical year was, quote, about 1,000. Another 16 or 17% thought it was about 10,000. And about 8% thought it was more than that. To put this in context, there are only about 20,000 murders in a typical year. Black people are responsible for maybe half of those. So, I mean, this opinion, this impression became extraordinarily widespread very rapidly, largely as a result, according to The Economist in late fall of 2020, Black Lives Matter, the national organization, received something like $11 billion in donations. So where the money went is not the subject of many of my writing, but is an interesting question. At any rate, it turned out that most of this, if we're talking about the question of racism in the USA today, and how we can break that down, how we can analyze that, it turned out that almost none of this was true. When I and others, like the Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald, actually dug into this, the total number of unarmed people shot by cops, we can get into overall police shootings, which are high in the USA during Q&A, if you guys want, but is well under 100 per year. And most of them seem to involve Caucasian and Hispanic criminals. Frankly, the total number involving Black folks, this gentleman was correct. It's about 10 to 20 per year. Last year it was 18 across the entire United States. The majority involving whites and especially Latinos, for whatever reason, especially Latinos, simply are not covered by the mainstream U.S. media. Even the gap at which black Americans are shot by the cops may well not be due to any form of racism, largely because we are a younger and more urban population. Again, not for any magical reason. The black crime rate, as reported by crime victims, not by police officers, is about 2.4 times the white rate. By the way, to put this in context, the male crime rate is about 10 times the female rate. So these kind of gaps are extraordinarily common. If you want to talk about disparities versus discrimination, about 90% of the people in jail in virtually every state are guys. So perhaps we are dealing with a problem of institutionalized sexism. Or maybe there's another explanation. Men are bigger and slightly dumber and commit virtually all of the crime. I don't know. It's an open question. People should investigate. But when a top black academic named Roland Fryer, who again is one of those guys you really should read if you're interested in social science research, adjusted for variables of this kind, Roland Fryer over at Harvard, one of their political scientists. So for example, whether a suspect had a weapon, crime rate in an area, which is very predictive of police involvement across both black and frankly poor white communities down there in Dallas. He found that cops were about 30% more likely to shoot a white guy than a similar black guy in terms of what happens to the claim of systemic racism when you adjust for things. Some scholars have speculated pretty openly. I don't have an opinion on this. I don't know. But some people have speculated pretty openly that this is because there's not an equivalent movement to BLM for broke white or Hispanic guys. There had to be a better way to say that, but those shootings are unlikely to get an officer fired or killed or arrested. And this turns out to be very true. There are many tragic shootings of Caucasian and Latino men, Tony Timpa, Dylan Noble, that are of exactly the same kind, that have had very, very little public follow-up. Narratives often collapse like this. Again, by the way, in terms of racism itself, I don't want to downplay the problem of racism. Human tribalism is universal across the species. Right now, roughly 10% of both whites and African Americans test as racist. It's actually very easy to test for racism in political science. Simply anonymously ask people questions. Obviously, don't ask, are you a bigot? But in something like a list experiment format, you could ask people questions like, which of these things would you not do? Voluntarily work for a boss of X race, date someone of X race, so on down the line. Would you serve under an officer of, X skin color category? Obviously, the classic one is the work for, vote for question. Would you have any problem voting for a qualified candidate of a different ethnic group? You want to clarify that they're running in your party. So we still find fairly substantial rates of bigotry. I will note that the USA right now seems to be something like the third least racist country in the world, however. So this is a human, national, or international problem more than an American problem. The fact that people don't like one another across religious, skin tone, linguistic is the big one, really. If you've ever spent time in Africa or Eastern Europe, I mean, Russians and Ukrainians are physically indistinguishable, so on down the lines. I mean, this is an ancient evil of our species. Some might date it back to Babel, for example. I mean, there are specific beginning points that we've come up with to explain this problem. But at any rate, narratives often, so racism itself, of course, exists. Of course, you should never explain it away, never pretend it doesn't. But the narrative of a unique American systemic problem, in my opinion, often collapses in this fashion. So we've already looked at what happens to income, for example, early on in the little talk, where the white POC gap that is almost always just attributed to racism basically vanishes if you adjust for age and region and, for example, test scores. It turned out recently, I thought this was interesting in terms of the sort of contemporary real social science, the same thing is even true for the audit studies that find extreme bias, as opposed to some bias, against minority names. So two non-woke sociologists, rare birds indeed, Doctors Darolia, D-A-R-O-L-I-A, and Kodal, pointed out the obvious, that you have a problem adjusting for social class when you test for anything that involves race in the USA. So if you're sending out resumes to jobs, seeing if there's reluctance to hire people with stereotypical African American names, for example, you're not necessarily testing for the effect of race. If you're comparing Timmy to, quote, LaQuisha, for example, was a name that was used in one study, or Jamarian. I will note, without making fun of any of these names, that no one ever seems to send in resumes for Bubba or Nevaeh. So these people, with more tact perhaps than I demonstrate, decided simply to focus on last names. They didn't use Bubba either, but what they did was pair obviously ethnic last names, as I recall, Hernandez and Blackman, with quote-unquote ordinary first names. I think people would have some suspicions. But with standard American, if you will, first names, Mark and the like, Chloe, and sent these in very large numbers to potential corporate employers and tested to see whether the normal effect that is associated with racism in hiring endured, whether that remained. And almost none did. This paper is Diroli and Codell, 2016. It's been replicated a few times. What you seem to find with these very precise tests is a 2 to 3% effect that's still there, and that probably does reflect actual modern racism or sexism, which again, obviously exists. But you don't find that people are 40% more likely, or something like this, to reject Mike Blackman than Mike McCullough. So again, class, getting to the point here, is a variable that matters when you're looking at the things that people use to distinguish or discriminate among individuals. So you find the effect of racism or sexism or whatnot, whatever you're looking for, when you've adjusted for everything else and you're comparing identical people that differ in terms of what it is that you're looking for. This is one of the most basic and obvious points in social science. It's worth noting, by the way, and this is a pretty key point, this kind of multivariate, quote-unquote, culturalist model, unlike the sort of Ken-D'Angelo framework, can explain the 45% or so of situations where minorities win. So right now, if you go to Wikipedia or Britannica online, one of the things that was pretty startling when I started looking at group performance is that 8 of the 10 highest performing groups in the USA are not white. This is counting Jewish Americans as white, by the way, should anyone be curious. But number 1 is Indian Americans. We're using just raw income here in this fallen world. But Indian Americans are currently the number 1 finisher at $126,000. Followed by Taiwanese Americans, Filipino Americans, so on down the line. There's almost invariably a black or African descent group on the list. South Africans have made it in the past. Nigerians, if I recall correctly, have made it in the past. Nigerians are also the best educated group in the country. So it's an extraordinarily diverse roster up there at the top. I believe Macedonian and Australian immigrants were the 2, if you will, Gentile white groups in the top 10. Should anyone be curious? But, and good job, well done. Diversity. But people of color, in fact, dominate a range of arenas in the United States. I don't think this is much of a secret to anyone, from competitive professional athletics to much of music and the arts to a range within the qualitative social sciences. And again, magic is not necessary to explain this. So, this speech seems to have been printed twice here, so. Worst case, I'll wing it on the end. But best case, which happened, we won't have to. All right. So, but at any rate, neither Caucasian or minority success is in fact, given modern computer technologies such as Stata, all that difficult to explain. Looking at where people live and what degrees people get and what fields people train in and what scores match up with what fields explains how folks do almost perfectly without having to resort to either ghosts in the machine and sort of the prejudice of the gaps or creepy genetic explanations. Now, with that said, I want to end by making one of my opponent's strongest points for them. So, obviously, variables like how much money people have at the group level are influenced by past oppression and conflict. This is an extraordinarily obvious point in the other direction. So if you look at the Wikipedia list of groups by household performance, the bottom 14 are all Indian tribes. They're not Caucasian or of African descent, as it happens. I mean, you have the Navajo, the Chippewa, the Iroquois, the Comanche, so on down the line. I don't think that anyone thinks that all of these people who fought magnificently against the USA for 200 or 300 years just happened to have some set of cultural problems that began the moment they were sent off to the reservation. Obviously, when you look at many things, where people live, I mean, slave ships came to the South, for example, where wages are lower. Past conflict and past oppression play a role. But the reality is that if we're talking about a society where competition seems to be extraordinarily fair right now today, we already have a term for being poor, social class. So poverty today seems to be extraordinarily diverse. I would actually recommend that you guys go to the breakdown of groups by income or by, if you will, performance that I'm describing. Those that don't have a lot of money right now don't necessarily all look like one another. The people bringing up the bottom in American society right now include a fairly large number of white American groups. I live in Kentucky. I actually didn't mean that as a humor line. The average income for Appalachian Americans right now is right up there for African Americans, or right up there with the average income for African Americans, about $48,000. Black Americans, I believe, on average, about $46,000. And again, there are systematic issues that began quite recently for both of those groups that don't have much of anything to do with, for example, slavery that contribute to that. So, for example, fatherlessness in the United States, in the extraordinarily recent past, I mean, fatherlessness since 1945 has gone from 10% in the black community, about 4% in the white community. Someone might correct me on that by a point or two, but to 37% for Caucasians and 72% for African Americans, respectively. Yeah, I mean, you pointed out that's incredible. Among people under 35, less than 50% of kids in any ethnic group except Asian Americans have a present dad. I mean, that's a remarkable statistic. And again, I lean right, obviously. I would attribute that to the welfare policies that began in the 1960s and 1970s. But there's actually a very coherent left-wing response that centers on outsourcing, so on down the line, shipping the core of American industry, the potential ability to support your family across the seas, the corruption of the contemporary ruling class. At any rate, whichever one of those options you go with, you can't link that thing, which destroyed both black and Appalachian families, to our ancient conflicts in the past. And for whatever reason, scrolling down through the breakdown of people that just don't have any money today, I'll simply list them. African Americans, Appalachian Americans, Cajun Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, all around the same. And then you move into the people in the great native nations. So I think to really remove the legacy of the past, we have to some extent get past the conflict today, which is very much centered on upper middle class social justice warriors arguing with upper middle class Turning Point USA advocates very, very much of the time. And sort of, I mean, I'm speaking at a Christian institution, or for one, so I'll say perhaps we should move toward doing what Jesus once commanded, helping the least of these who most need that assistance across all lines because they be our human brothers. I suggest you get busy doing that. And I would also say that when it comes to how people perform in our society today, once that help's been given, race would probably be the least important of the variables that predict that. But again, I expect a lot of people to step up and disagree with that now. That's the written portion of the speech. All right, as usual with these, I'm available for, say, 40, 45 minutes to have people ask me things, more than willing. Sir?
multi-generational, say, black families, where if you're my age, grandfather could have gone to college, parents could be doctors and lawyers, and so is there the same, has there been any study of the inherited wealth of multi-generational rich black families and comparing them to comparably situated white families?
Well, there are two levels of looking at that. There's a great book called A Black Success Story that looks at West Indians and also, if I recall, the sort of black American upper middle class. And yeah, what they find is that, first of all, there are very many successful black groups. Again, I don't want to keep harping on this single metric of performance, income, or this single list. The encyclopedia has one, you know. But going down, I mean, you find Nigerians, Ghanaians, West Indians. It's not a direct competition between, you know, our great ethnic groups. There are quite a few black groups that are outpacing the white average. And most of those groups display the same success sequence characteristics as successful white groups. So yes, within all of those groups, simple things. By the way, something that a high school coach told me has stuck with me since and is actually 100% true in empirical terms. You need to do roughly 4 things not to fail in life. Graduate from high school, take any job and work it until you get a better job. This is actual fact, especially for males. Do not be convicted of a felony and wait until either marriage or the age of 25 to have your first child. I thought that this was just sort of, you know, old Coach Panka talking, but this is absolutely accurate. There are multiple studies. The National Center for Fathering actually has all the documents supporting all 4 of these points. So I think that successful black groups do this just as successful white groups do. And you find that with the Southern black, quote-unquote, aristocracy. You find that with West Indians. You find that with African immigrants. African immigrants are quite arguably the most successful group in the country. Nigerians are the best educated group in the country. And if you go to an elite college, and I would rank U of I Law at, you know, the bottom of the truly elite tier, you certainly see an entertaining back and forth between sort of people who held lordly rank in the motherland and people who are immigrants from the rising East Asian countries, with both of them very much coming here to compete with the elite of this country. So there's that. I will add one other sentence. Something is impacting this among a later generation of black families. Some argue this is racism. I think, looking at the data, it's fatherlessness. But we now see that black boys raised in successful families are less likely to be successful. New York Times ran a good piece on this. I don't know whether social science underlies it. I didn't go beyond the article. But they found that black boys raised in wealthy families are, I mean, they're not usually failures, but they're less likely than white boys in wealthy families to go on to become rich. Many become sort of middle-class slackers. Some get arrested. The one thing I didn't see them adjust for is there a dad in the home? Among wealthy black families, now even among wealthy white families, where the problem tends to be more divorce, that's something that's becoming less and less common. But in traditional, stable, 2-parent families and well-off black communities, yeah, you see the same patterns you do in well-off white communities. The problem, again, I don't think the ending of the speech went as smoothly as the beginning, but probably because I was making the other argument, but the problem, again, is that there are fewer well-off black or native families, and you can't omit the role of the past in that. But among those that have traditionally taken that success path, yeah, it works just as well. All right, sir.
He mentioned Black Wall Street. How do you kind of gather? I'm not going to tell the other, since you're here to speak, but how do you summarize not just only that event, but the thought process around abolishing people that are coming?
Well, you're a hate-filled nut job and you think of them as enemies? I mean, if you're talking about what would be the motivation behind the attackers of, I mean, so I'll be very blunt and amoral about this. I mean, the thought process would be, well, this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. You know, I mean, I was talking recently with a friend who just didn't understand how Vladimir Putin could have attacked Ukraine. And I explained it to him by saying Vladimir Putin thinks of himself as a warrior and does not like Ukrainians. And to me, this was a total explanation. And to him, it was not an explanation at all. I think it's the same sort of thing here. Many whites, and no doubt in this time, many blacks and natives detested members of the other group and thus regularly committed evil acts against them. I think it's very important that now we discuss this sort of stuff honestly. Very, very important. I mean, the Tulsa race massacre is finally being called by that label. One thing I will say is that I don't think looking at history is going to be tough for blacks and whites and natives, especially men. I mean, it's worth remembering, women got the right to vote in 1920. So when people start exploring history and saying, well, this is we're going to see the evils that were committed against my group by others, I mean, I think natives are going to have something to say about the Buffalo Soldiers. Yeah, and the Red Buck Hunters and all think about the names. You know, the other, African American, Irish American, so on, army units that fought them. History was an extraordinarily brutal process of mutual combat until pretty recently. Not to keep dropping dates and stats, but the Geneva Conventions in their final form were 1954. Hitler finally defeated, last the werewolves rounded up 1946. So I think that our modern attitudes virtually did not exist until the beginning of the early modern era. So no excuses, but that would be the answer. So let's memorialize them, let's avenge them, let's give their descendants something if we can, but I think that would be the motivation. Sarah. Good to meet you, Kyle Day.
Thank you. As a proud Ozark American from this, my people and my family are from this hills, and you're right. Kentucky and Arkansas is a very closely state. They're a rural state with a lot of small towns and so forth. And again, I agree with all you're saying, academically, but driving up here today, we see the Confederate flags, right? And we all know what that means. It means, blacks are not welcome, okay? And we're sitting here, this is a sundowner town. Bentonville was a sundowner town. Springdale was a sundowner town. And frankly, if blacks moved into a neighborhood, some of the white folks would freak out. And the housing prices would go down even today here in Bentonville, Arkansas. And again, I agree with you academically. How do we bridge that gap where the rubber hits the road? And that's an everyday reality. I mean, that we still are with. And so, like you say, maybe history doesn't matter, but when people say what those guys did to that kid in Georgia, or the George Floyd killing, I mean, those historical memories just creep up. And how do we go from? I know I'm off topic, but it's how do we get to there?
No, I like the good, tough questions, and I mean, I expect they'll get tougher than that. First of all, I like Ozark American. Also, always appreciate a good three-piece. So I think a couple things. First of all, I think it's important not to totally correlate the past with the present. I'm going to walk around tonight. I don't think anyone's going to come up to me and ask what I'm doing, Sonny. So the past does segue into the present. As the reality, though, of continuing prejudice in working class communities, one, I don't think that's entirely a white issue. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I can tell you might have some issues walking around dressed like that in some black or even Italian American neighborhoods. But what do you do about it? I think that the passage of time is something that is going to eradicate the large majority of that. And I think that the goodwill of people in society is something that is going to move toward the eradication of that. So, if you get a black neighbor, don't move. I don't think you would. But I don't think this changes the essential point that I'm making, which is that many of the gaps that are attributed to hidden racism within society don't seem to be when you adjust for things. Right now, we are working. So I think that this is going to be kind of an awkward metaphor. As blue becomes yellow, it segues through green. I don't think anyone looks at very light green and says, that's dark blue. And I think that's kind of the situation when it comes to a lot of the discussion around racism. If right now we're looking at working class white communities in the Ozark Mountains, or we're looking at the south side of Chicago on the black side of things and saying, well, some of these people around here are still pretty prejudiced. I don't think that it's still a reality that the large majority of, for example, income differences in society are caused by racism. So I think that what we have to do in society to solve your problem is take the large majority of people that agree with you and focus on removing the residual evil of prejudice in society. And actually, thank you for guiding me toward that answer. I think the issue is when I said we've got 8 or 10% of both whites and blacks that are bigots, I think you just identified from talking about the south side of the Ozark Martins where you might find some of them. The problem with the CRT narrative, I think, using a hokey but real label, is that the claim is that everyone, to some extent, is a secret bigot in their hearts. So this I think, is the issue. And again, I think your question is really useful helping me identify that difference. Everyone should call out someone who has an 18-foot Confederate flag in their front yard. Like, yeah, sure, bro, it's your right, but that's not cool. And, you know, to perhaps a slightly lesser degree, I'd feel the same way about, like, the ANC flag or the hammer and sickle, both of which I've seen back in my old area. But the problem with the most extreme campuses and so on I've spoken on is that the people that are advocating for, say, radical feminism or full diversity training 3 hours every 2 weeks for everyone in the institution aren't bringing that to the Ozark Mountains. That's still going on the Smith or St. Olaf campus. So I think that's the distinction. I don't think that the problem
Thank goodness they're not.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of rambling, but I think you brought me to this answer. I don't think the problem in the power-based institutions in society, like Yale University, is systemic racism. And I think that the continual focus on, like, the upper middle class conflict I made fun of at the end of the speech, I think the continuing focus on that distracts from residual real racism. Like, I don't think the majority of people today among whites or POC are racist. If I were to take an anonymous survey of this room and ask something like, would you have trouble voting for or working for someone of a different ethnicity in a religious institution in Arkansas, a large majority of people would say no. So you should work on, to the extent it becomes a public problem for others, correcting those who would still say yes, but not on endless self-purification and flagellation as a person who's already pretty solid on these issues. That would be my advice. Like, so one last comment. If after your question you spend a lot of time wondering if you're a racist, you should stop doing that and do something else. Go find the guy with the Confederate flag. Say, hey, buddy, move that away from the road. I think you got one back there, and I also think you have a couple at this table. Yeah, I want to hear some of these. What up?
Hi. You mentioned these surveys a lot where, you know, you ask people if they would have a problem voting for someone of a certain race or ethnicity. How would you explain or account for things like social desirability bias? And maybe people who do have a lot of internal bias but understand that if I answer this way, maybe I'll be looked at wrong, or fear of judgment, things like that.
That's a great question. So I'll give two answers. I'll give two answers. One is just short and glib, and one's the full methods answer. The short, glib answer is sort of faith. I mean, so when I do surveys, obviously they're totally anonymous, desks 4 feet apart, all the usual protections. I mean, there are people that actually polygraph survey respondents. We know that doesn't work perfectly, but are you reasonably willing to do this? People do take sort of word of honor tests reasonably seriously, we find. But to some extent, if people are lying about everything they say on surveys, then all of social science is worthless. Now, some might say, but we tend to find that when we look at polls, like the margin of error is really consistently 2 to 3%, and that indicates that's not true. So, I mean, when I survey, I would estimate perhaps even a 4 or 5% margin of error, but within that, I do think that we know what we're doing, because otherwise, everything is wrong. The short answer, though, is that there are ways to test that. Like for my dissertation, I actually did what's called a list experiment, which is designed to expose people lying. So you do the regular survey, and then you do another test that's designed to trick people. And you're probably familiar with this, but where you divide a group of 1,000 people into 2 groups. One group of people is asked about a series of 4 things. Would you ever do any of these? And the other group is asked without being told about a series of 5 things. I mean, would you ever do any of these? And the 5th thing asked about race. So my questions were date interracially and ever change your race. I was testing the famous Andrew Hacker bell hooks question. And what I found was that the 2 were pretty similar. Some people lied, most people didn't. So there are actually very sophisticated ways to do this. I mean, if you get into, KSU is a good school, the Arkansas schools are good schools, but if you get into like some of the Ivy institutions, like they'll put electrodes in your brain and ask you. So like we do know that most of the time people aren't lying too much. By the way, this is again, keeping this PG, but where this becomes a real problem is with questions about drug use and sexual partners. We found women, interestingly, are much more honest than men. But we found that it's remarkably difficult to get guys under 30 to give truthful answers to some questions. There are questions that we've kind of given up on. But are you a racist is not one of those questions. What I would say is, right now we've got 7% of Americans, let's say, that generally will admit to being racist. I would take that out to 10 to 15%. But that still implies that the 85% majority of people are not extreme racists, let's say. The issue for me with a lot of the racism literature is that it reminds me of the self-help literature. So many people I know, especially upper middle class female friends, are inveterate self-help readers. And whenever I look at this stuff, I don't criticize people's life decisions, not my business, but my immediate reaction as someone who's in sales at an executive level is they don't want you to change. They don't want you to lose weight. To lose weight, you go to the running path. They want you to keep buying the shake. And it's the same thing with, in particular, Robin DiAngelo. No hate, some good advice in the books, but it's like, the Robin DiAngelo, Are You Still a Racist coloring book? Like, all of that stuff is targeted at people who are genuinely not racist, who are probably in interracial campus relationships, and who are in the 85%. Working on how to target the 15%, how to go into white and black working class communities, actually put yourself at some risk, and deal with the issues of race in society, that's a tough thing that people don't want to do. So I think we can trust the surveys to within 5%, but like his Confederate flag point, all those people that are marching around at Portland State University need to go into the Cascade Mountains and talk to people about how to get along with their countrymen, and they are never ever going to do that. So right now we're going through a whole time-wasting pantomime. There are things that can make you much less racist, like playing varsity sports or joining the Army. But I mean, now I'm getting into just different comments here. We can trust the surveys reasonably well, and the techniques I described I think are effective. Good question. All good questions so far, actually. So far.
So, oh, you don't have the
Dr.
microphone.
Maranta, how are you? All right. How are you? Shake hands all over. I think this guy had a question first. I can answer it. I can walk around.
So I'll ask a cynical question.
Okay.
So, because I'm a cynic. So, a lot of could one argue, in an odd sort of way, that a lot of the anti-racist efforts are in fact racist against Asians and maybe serve the interest of whites. I read Kenny Sue's book. A lot of the affirmative action schemes we use only slightly increase the percentage of blacks and Hispanics, hugely decrease the percentage of Asians, and pretty substantially increase the percentage of whites. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's possible. There's a very old line in both business and academia. I mean, never assume focused, intentional evil when you can assume incompetence and laziness. So I don't think most people have a really professional grasp of advanced statistics. Like, I don't think most people know the full percentage of Asian Americans that would be disadvantaged by a specific policy as versus white Americans. Subconsciously, probably. And in specific cases like the upper middle class white parents at Brearley, yeah. TJ, the #1 high school in the country in Virginia, yes. This gets into something very important though. Like when we're breaking down this reality that East Asians and Nigerians and Jewish Americans are the highest performing people in the country, we tend to think of affirmative action in terms of black people specifically. And there's an element of racism to this actually, being advantaged over white people. That's not really how this works in modern, diverse America. I mean, Hispanics, who, against many metrics, aren't really outperforming blacks, despite being majority Caucasian. I mean, this is complex if you're arguing from either a CRT or a hereditarian perspective, though which I am not. But I mean, Hispanics make up 17% of the population, blacks 12. So I mean, a group of people very welcome in the country, but not traditionally long-term abused here, are major beneficiaries of affirmative action. And affirmative action actually hurts, for example, East Asians, South Asians, more than it does whites or Caucasians. So like if you actually had, let's talk top 20 Ivy schools, if you actually took off all population representation caps, there'd be plenty of high-performing white students. But I mean, you're talking probably about a 40% East Asian Harvard, probably another 10% maybe a piece or combined South Asians, black immigrants. This is before we get into Jewish Americans, the white category. So I think that people have to, at some level, consciously or not, be aware of that. I'm not really giving an answer here. I think that middle and upper class white parents certainly have to suspect that merit competition is no longer going all that well for them. And I think some of them openly know it. I think the people that are trying to get into the Ivies openly know it. And you see this over and over, so that's the answer. And you see this over and over again also. I mean, like the TJ admissions policy change, I think they went up to... Oh, yeah, Thomas Jefferson High School in suburban DC in Virginia is the #1 ranked high school in the country. And this school had an Asian problem. This was very frequently said in these terms. The school was something like 65% Asian. And they revamped their admissions policy saying they wanted to let in more disadvantaged black and Hispanic kids. What happens is that they let in a bunch of rich black and Hispanic kids, so they're now like 9% wealthy black people. And they let in a lot less Asians, and they are now also, you might correct this, but more than 50% white. So yeah, that is the incentive, sometimes conscious, yeah. I also think, though, that you have to look at the flip side there. Asian Americans are probably going to be the backbreaker for affirmative action. Affirmative action, unless black people can really unify around sort of an ADOS identity. I mean, you're starting to see this now where people are saying, you know, I'm not a person of color, like I'm black. Like we can talk about reparations instead of affirmative action, but like black people and maybe natives do have a claim on the country. So, I mean, you might see the positions change, and maybe some white people would go along with that one. But just to tell someone who came here from Taipei that they should be disadvantaged in favor of someone who came here from Mexico City, I think strikes most people as just inherently ridiculous. And for that matter, one of those people might be someone who just came here from the Ukraine. So, I mean, we're a nation of immigrants, and a lot of, many of the white people in the USA have ancestors who arrived here after 1910. So it's a complex situation. That's a good question about it.
Isn't the group that most benefited from affirmative action is
I will kind of respond to that since a lot of us are pretty familiar with the maths here. I think that's a pure statistical artifact. When people say that, what they mean is that a typical affirmative action program will target minorities and women. So if you have the and women in there, 50% of the people admitted under the auspices of the program might be women, and whites are the largest group. I mean, if you look at the size of preference gaps, I mean, under almost every program, that would be blacks or Latinos. Just because there's no difference in white male and white female scores on most board tests. The black, white, and Hispanic white gaps are no longer enormous, but if they're there at all and they're bigger than 100 points, like it wouldn't make sense white women are the biggest beneficiaries. That's one of those lines like the debate about whether the majority of people on welfare are white. I mean, probably, but that is just because the majority of people are white. So I mean, like 76% of people this is something worth remembering. If you're counting Hispanic Caucasians, which I usually do, 76% of Americans are white. So when people say that, for example, only 22% of Supreme Court justices are black, which is the figure now with the new Biden appointee and with Mr. Thomas, only 12% of Americans are black. So people often dramatically overstate these numbers. Something similar I notice now is happening with gay Americans, where if you ask people that consume a lot of television what percentage of the country they think is gay, LGBT perhaps, it's around 30%. And in fact, the percentage of people that identify as gay, I think, is 4.6%. So again, there's a difference between media presentation and reality. I mean, while I'm very proud of my ethnic background, minorities are minorities for a reason. When the 50% mark is crossed, mathematically, but so no, I don't think that's empirically true, although it can sometimes be close. All right, it's 9 o'clock. It's up to you guys whether you want to keep them coming. I mean, I'm here. I'm going to go up to the hotel after this, maybe have one drink after the event. I'm sorry? I'm fine.
Yeah, so I just had a question about, you've talked a little bit about the idea of challenging your neighbor when you see racism, calling out kind of an individual responsibility
Within
approach
reason.
to challenging these things, right? But I think young people, I don't want to, I'm not disparaging young people, they want to do something, right? So is there a do something policy that you could actually get behind? Is there something the state, the government can actually do? Because one of your, I won't say opponents, but one of the alternative books, you know, has a suggestion about mandatory service, right? Like forcing people to interact in these groups. But I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but your thoughts on, is there something that can actually be done? Because I don't know from a political standpoint if it sells with the younger crowd that, well, we can't actually do anything, it's all up to you.
Well, I mean, there are 2 points that I would make there. First of all, in terms of if you want to take service with people of different races, you can join the Army or play sports at any time. And I don't mean to be at all glib about this, but like those are the 2 most integrated enterprises in the USA. So I think there's a difference between kind of the fantasy of I'm going to be an anti-racist crusader and the reality of just interacting with people of different races. I mean, every time I go to the basketball court or the golf course, I see hundreds of people, mostly men, but of every imaginable ethnicity out there talking trash to each other, betting, making jokes, griping about their wives, trading recipes. I mean, we're not savages in this day and age. You know, just like living life. So, I mean, I think that is how I would engage with people of other ethnicities. And, of course, there are things that you can do, you know, traditionally integrated fraternities, service fraternities. Join a white Greek organization as a black guy or a black one as a white guy. I mean, there are dozens of institutions like this that are easily available to you. I don't mean to, again, be sarcastic or anything like that, but I don't think we need to create, say, a State Department of anti-racism or something like that. Just go out for that varsity football team. You know, I also, one of the points that I think that I'm making underlying this in terms of why it's so easy to do this, why it's so easy to interact with, you know, people of different races, or with independent and liberated women, or with immigrants from other societies. This fight was largely won a long time ago. This is something that we seem reluctant in the educated portion of the country to note. But I mean, the Brown versus Board decision, which at least de jure desegregated the United States in 1954. The Civil Rights Act, which made racism civilly and often criminally illegal. Imperfect, of course, but let's not forget what this law was. Most countries don't have this. 1964. We've had pro-minority affirmative action at a reasonably broad scale since 1967 with the Philadelphia Plan. So, in fact, we have a large number of institutions in place specifically to allow people to interact. I mean, and there are whole movies about this, about the first integrated Army regiments, and Remember the Titans, about what happened when sports started integrating in the late 1960s and so on. So I don't think I have any suggestions beyond those, beyond just go hang out with your neighbor and so on. I do think that and this is kind of my last point on this. I tend to be a long talker, as you guys may have noticed. But I think that one of the decisions we're going to have to make is whether we do need sort of a new civil rights movement today. So I think that the argument from, for example, Dr. Kendi, some of the people I've mentioned, is that we need to return to kind of the civil rights philosophy until we've closed all the gaps between people that I'm talking about. And this is where the idea of like the Department of Anti-Racism or the mandatory 2 years of service with people in your community comes from. I don't think so. I think we need to keep building on what we already have in place. So I would just recommend doing that. I would just recommend finding an integrated club or group or something, church in your community, and going there. That's about all I got. I see more hands coming up. All right, I'll take them in this order. Sir, over here. Or actually, I think you've had your hand up for quite a while. So let's come around to this end of the table.
You mentioned tribalism.
Okay.
And, you know, I think people are definitely inherently tribal. I agree with the sense of what you're saying, that if tribalism is based on color, then we're talking about something that's obviously very destructive and pernicious. But if human beings are essentially tribal, then what sort of tribes should we try to build? And I'll just pass the thought by you, and then I'd love to hear your response. But right before you were talking, we at the table here, I was mentioning, it makes people uncomfortable when I, say nice things about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I think one of the things the Jehovah's Witnesses have done well is that the Jehovah's Witness movement or religion is very interracial.
Good.
And they don't care, because the Jehovah's Witness tribe is devoted to Jehovah, and all these other identities don't matter. And so that's an example of a kind of tribalism where at least within that tribe, they get along with each other because they have some other identity. What sort of, if human beings are inherently tribal, and if we want to get away from tribe identity based on color, et cetera, then what sort of tribes should we aspire to create?
Well, no, I mean, I will say I'm Catholic by background, and we have the same pretty much pro-Jesus policy. So, I mean, in terms of the Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't know if that's distinct from other Christian or Christian descent groups. But I actually think you hit on the point, which is that the way to get past kind of primitive tribalism, like he share my color kind of stuff, is with nation, religion. Those things have their own flaws, but they're infinitely better than just, you know, knitting together a flag and going to war with the people in the next valley. So, I mean, I think to some extent we've already come up with these ideas. I mean, nation, religion, shared communities of interest, I think that was the whole idea when we talk about the unified groups in society, even something like the Rotarians that so many people belonged to 50 years ago, I mean, and that now seem to be experiencing a resurgence. That would probably be the answer, that you find something, whether that's your country, your communal organization, the military to some extent, that veteran community, faith, that you believe in that's different from simply, I'm a big Indian, to quote, I'm talking about Gulliver's Travels, not, you know, ethnicity, but you're fighting for something that's not meaningless. That's the ideal form of tribalism if humans have to have this instinct. So that, I think we've already discovered this. It's just the problem with any enduring addictive style problem is relapse. So we consistently see a fall back into the violent form of tribalism. So within developed nation states, there lurks always racialism, there lurks always sectionalism. And you just really can't tolerate it. I mean, that's the problem with anything from the South Will Rise Again to CRT. If someone says, well, we want a separate wing within the school for Hispanics, you just have to say no. Whatever the guise is, whatever the Southerners have experienced this, blacks have experienced this, both those claims actually are true enough, but no, because that is the negative form of tribalism that will then lead to a response, because the other people, unless they're cowards, aren't just going to take being insulted for the next couple of years. So just find the positive identity group and stick with that, and that's the response to the negative form of tribalism. So I think, I mean, you identified a couple of good ones, but faith community, national community, shared identity community, chamber of commerce, whatnot. I mean, just any of those. Humans have already come up with most of the good ideas. I think that would be like the idea of religion or doing business with people or something like that. You're not hearing that from the first time from this speaker up here in a blazer, you know. But those are the answers to racism. Good question.
So my question is a little different. You said something about systemic racism.
Okay.
I actually believe that systemic racism is very prevalent in this country.
Okay.
In the sense that we warehouse black and Hispanic kids in poor inner city school systems where they are subjected to or victims of an educational process that definitely does not meet their needs.
Yep.
How do we solve that problem? How do we get people talking about real systemic racism as opposed to this silly hand-waving stuff?
Okay. Now, I was being very postmodern. I took a picture of you guys, by the way. So I think that, so this gets into one of my problems with all these terms. Like, so again, no one disagrees with that inner city schools are terrible. With the racism, so Appalachian schools are terrible too. But there's, again, you also don't want to get into a back and forth between sort of minority and poor white communities. Let's engage the problem. Yes, the schools are awful. The issue with the systemic racism claim in this context, though, I think, when I started unpacking this as a political scientist, this actually is one of my spheres of expertise, comes back to the question of who's responsible, to some extent. So in Chicago, we were actually talking about this at table today. I've done some mentoring work in the schools in Chicago. I quite openly lean right. I teach at a black school. I guess I'd call myself pro-black, although I'm more pro-human. But when I went in there, my initial impression was these schools have to be badly underfunded. This is one of those things that everyone kind of thinks offhand when you're kind of a young executive. The books when I was there maybe 5-6 years ago still said Clinton was president. I say that, people think it's a joke. But when I actually started looking at the situation, the schools in Chicago get about $26,000, $27,000 per pupil per year. The schools in Chicago are also in a black-run city that, whether or not it's been led specifically by African Americans, has been led by a highly diverse, democratic, woke team for something like 50 years, like Daley Jr., Lightfoot, so on down the line. So when you talk about the systemic racism of the schooling in Chicago, the systemic racism in place is elected 60% minority Democratic officials administering $30,000 per kid. And by the way, again, I actually am not partisan tonight. Like our elected officials in Appalachia are, all Republican, mostly white guys administering $19,000 per kid. So what are they doing? It's anyone can steal. another great human vice. Anyone can throw money in a gunny sack and run away, apparently. But obviously, no formal allegations. But the question is, though, really, when you talk about this, so like Lori Lightfoot, many of Chicago's power players are experts at alleging, for example, the systemic racism of the surrounding suburbs. Detroit's even better at this. So the claim is that they're using the threat of charter schools to take our money from our underfunded schools. They don't want to fund minority kids. But the $30,000 a year still endures. As Galileo Galilei once said, it still moves. So that's actually a tough one. I favor school choice. Give the kids an option, make the schools compete. I favor some practical measures. There are Illinois governors in the past that have suggested significant audits of the CTU, Chicago Teachers Union, the Chicago school system. Beyond that, though, it's hard to solve problems without people getting engaged. You're going to have to work on deeper issues in both the regions I mentioned, of family structure, for example, engaged parenting. Who are the teachers being sent into these schools, and what are their goals as educators, so on, to really change that. But again, I don't find the term I don't want to get into an issue of semantics, because your point is brutal about these schools. It's valid, but if we're using the term racism to describe a black mayor overseeing a minority school system in a democratic city, I think we've gotten to the point of kind of la-la land here. The real issue is how to fix this sort of long-standing municipal corruption, because it's not some kind of white outsider that's responsible for this. Yeah, it's a serious point. It's tough to answer. Sir.
You've already kind of gone into what my question was about. So I'm an administrator. I'm always trying to find the way between the two different sides that explains it all. This seems to me a lot about questions of definitions. So yes. At JBU we read D'Angelo's book, and it seemed in some ways that she was redefining racism as discrimination and then calling herself even a racist. Once you've said that's the definition of racism, then yeah, everyone is.
Yes.
So I could agree with you to say, well, that's not really the right way of defining it, but I'm struggling with your seeming dismissal of systemic racism when you've already laid out at the end of your presentation how there are lots of different groups who clearly have struggled for long periods of time, and there's things that have happened in our history that have brought that about.
Well,
so can we say that there is such a thing as systemic racism, whether it's zoning laws, and accept that part, even if we might reject the more extreme definition of racism as just discrimination?
Well, again, first of all, you guys are free countrymen, and you guys can use whatever terms you want. But I have the traditional sort of center-right business view that words mean things. And I think your question is actually a skilled and precise one, kind of trying to find the middle path there. But I think that a great advantage for the social justice left is that they have most of the English teachers. And so they are very skilled at making up, I'll still stick with BS before this audience, and just sort of arguing that this BS replaces pre-existing words. So I think you almost got it when you gave D'Angelo's definition of racism. D'Angelo's definition of racism is any system that produces a performance gap. So it's the same for D'Angelo and Kendi. D'Angelo and Kendi argue that the only reasons you would ever see a performance gap between groups are 1, genetic inferiority, and 2, hidden subtle racism. Like, I wasn't making up or even exaggerating that. They say that. So any system that produces a performance gap, which would be anything, when you think about it, the tax code technically would disadvantage whites, SAT disadvantages blacks, and perhaps even more Hispanics. No, still blacks last year. We'll get them. But I mean, just so on down the line, I mean, like, everything would be racist. And so you can argue that everyone is a racist because you are complicit in systems that produce performance gaps. Yeah. The problem, though, Sarah, is that that is not the definition of racism. Racism is a belief, and all the dictionaries have really held the line on this one, although some have changed on systemic, and all the social science journals really held the line on this one, except for 2 I can think of. But racism is a belief in the genetic inferiority of one or more racial groups. So, like, using the traditional definition of racism, and I don't see a reason not to. I edit for a journal. No, that has nothing to do with racism. That's like me saying I'm a sexist because I believe in gentlemanliness or something. I mean, that's a somewhat weak example, but that would just be me redefining a word to make any quote-unquote trad male a sexist. I can see why someone might do that, but it's just sort of not what the word means. So, like, in terms of what you described as systemic racism, I would say that it is true that some groups are more likely to be poor because of past defeats. I think that's it. And I think we should help the poor. The groups that are in this position include a large number of white groups. The issue in Appalachia was the labor struggle. I'm not as up on labor history as I should be, but my understanding is that the coal mines, obviously no whites in the USA were slaves, but the coal mines kept people in an indentured service/peonage role. Thus, I owe my soul to the company store and all of that. And when people emerged from that, I mean, you're talking Red Robins, you're talking like late 1940s, 80, 90 years of this, they had many of the same problems that existed in post-slavery communities. Something similar happened in much of the Ozarks, as I understand. This isn't my area to really comment on. But I mean, I would assume that Ozark, Appalachian, Cajun communities, that's why they're where they are on the income scale. So I think it's kind of silly to say that white guys in the Ozarks, who were the dominant racial group, were the victim of systemic racism. I think they lost and experienced class oppression. So I think that's something over here, and then there's racism over here. So when people talk about redlining was a disgusting thing that happened in the USA. My understanding also is that redlining was banned by law in either 58 or 68. That doesn't mean the impacts are gone, of course. But we can say that past racism shaped class performance today, or something like that, without claiming that there's some hidden form of redlining going on today. I think that's just, it's the linguistic definition. I think we're just disagreeing semantically. The point is, though, when we're debating these people, because I think we'd both be on the same side debating them, it's important to understand these semantic points. You just get tied in knots. The point, the sort of the center-right anti-racist point that I think most of the room would agree on here is actually really coherent. It's probably 75% of the debate. It's just important not to agree with the starting point, like, well, do you agree that any gap is racism? Because once you do, then you've said you're a racist. The really tricky thing about the Kendi argument, actually, is the point where if you say you're not a racist, then you're a racist. Because the only options are genetic bigotry or racism. Or no, the only options are believing in racism or believing in genetic bigotry. So it's very important to say up front, no, I disagree with that premise. I think the fact the average black guy is 30 years younger makes a big difference. Because then you've jumped out of the box that the argument creates. So I think that's my point. I think, again, a skillful, logically phrased question, but I would jump out of the box. I think there's a different definition of class, of racism, of all the words we're using. Oh, okay.
Before we exit, I have something I would like to say as an African American sitting in this room.
All right.
If you're going to a school like John Brown University, you're going there to integrate your faith in learning. And as we use scripture like Galatians as a blueprint for our lenses, then we can't adopt a system of the world, and I'll try to retrofit that in a bibliocentric potpourri. It just doesn't mix. It just doesn't mix, number one. Number two, that's why John Brown University exists, to integrate faith and learning and other schools of its like kind that are here, but to use the core values of the university or your ethos and allow that ethos to be integrated into your life so that we learn to be able to coalesce with others and to make a positive difference in the world. If out of this process of trying to be frozen in a vocabulary because it's prevalent in the world diminishes the students that you're trying to teach and train, that culture changes, and so therefore your ethos changes. Well, the university out front has its 4 pillars. Those don't change. It actually becomes a very rudimentary part, like Colossians speaks of. It becomes a prayer or a encouragement to students to grow deep roots because they know on the top that the winds of life will sway. So how can we do that? Teach students to be people of great ethos, and they'll penetrate the darkest parts of this world.
Woof.
Thank you so much for coming. I just want to say that thanks again to Mitch Mitchell, the director of ACRE at the University of Central Arkansas. If you have any complaints, just remember that Mitch helped fund the event. If you're
Blame that
interested
guy.
in making a donation, then you can talk to me afterwards. But we all owe a lot of thanks to Julia Bentley, my program manager, who has put everything together. And thank you again, Dr. Riley.
Sure.
You guys have a safe trip home.
Thank you.
Okay.